Few writers have attracted as much interest from Hollywood as Stephen King, and one of the most high-profile adaptations was Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The plot of that novel involves someone being frightened to be in a house, and that's precisely the emotion suffered by anyone reading one of King's books or watching his movies. King was the writer who brought the genre of horror, once confined to comics and B-movies, into the cultural mainstream. His novels, which include Carrie, Salem's Lot, Misery and The Stand, have sold more than 100 million copies around the world, making him probably the most successful writer in history. Most of them have also been turned into television series or films. The sales were not initially matched by critical praise, although King has recently been taken more seriously as a writer. A short story won the prestigious O. Henry Prize in America. In the autumn, King published his latest novel, Bag of Bones, about a best-selling novelist who's subject to supernatural visitations after the sudden death of his wife. When I met him for this Front Row special, I started by asking whether this writer, famous for frightening readers, was himself a nervous type.
Not particularly. I think that I get a lot of it out in the books, a lot of the fears that I have. I think that I have a tendency to look more for things to go wrong than for things to go right than other people do. I don't like to fly because I'm probably read too many horror stories about airplanes, and I don't like elevators because I'm convinced that the cable's going to break and plunge me down 40 stories. So I'm not nervous, but I'm a little bit more imaginative. I've trained my imagination, and sometimes that's a double-edged sword.
What about as a child? I mean, all the famous things, being scared of the dark, fear of death. Did you have those to an unusual degree?
Why do you ask that?
Because I'm afraid we tend to be drawn to people's childhood when we're looking for what it is that they do.
I think my point here is that a lot of interviews and a lot of the way that we think about people who write suspense or scary stories, tales of the supernatural, we've become a tiresomely Freudian world. So that the first thought is something must have really warped this guy's record as a child in order to make him write the sort of things that he did. And it's understandable given that Freudian emphasis on childhood trauma and childhood events that impact on the psyche. But I don't really believe it. I don't have much interest in the Freudian idea that childhood is more important than any other time of life. I think that we're born with certain inbuilt vectors. We go certain ways. I write because I have a talent as a writer. Having that talent, the talent wants to be used. You know, the same way that a spot on your arm may want to be scratched. So I write scary stories because that's the way my mind inclines, that's all. It isn't because I was warped as a child. And if I was, I certainly wouldn't tell you about it, would I?
Well, you saw me coming with that one. I mean, there is, for people who are Freudians, there's a thing in your childhood that they always pounce on, which is the thing of your father having left home when you were 2, the family being broken up. Now, a lot of your novels are about apparently happy families in which something comes, I mean, often literally in your books, out of the sky. Now, people seize on that. Do you see any connection with that?
No. It's true that my father left when I was 2 years old, but certainly there are people out there within sound of our voices right now whose dads left them or whose mums left them when they were very young, who don't write horror stories or indeed don't write stories of any kind. It's a question of that inbuilt talent. If I'm anything, I'm more of a Jungian. I'm more of the belief that we do carry race memory and that there are certain archetypes in human lives. There are things that we're afraid of just because we're afraid of them. They're passed down the way that the color of our eyes are passed down to us or the build, our physical build. So yeah, there are things that go on, but again, when people say, well, you might or might not have seen a kid run over when you were 2 years old on a train track, and that must have influenced the way that you write. I would argue back and say, no, if it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. I remember my mother telling me one time when I was, I think probably 7 or 8, what's known among Freudians as a formative age anyway. She grew up in Maine, and she was in Portland one day, walking down Congress Street, and she saw a crowd at the base of the Graymore Hotel, and she went over and she asked what was going on, and somebody said, "Oh, there's a man, a sailor, out there on a ledge on a high floor, and he's threatening to jump." The man did jump, and I said, "What was it like? Did you see him strike the pavement?" And she said, and I never forgot this, "Green goo in a sailor suit." And you can say that hearing that sort of a story at the age of 7, you can say this if you're a Freudian, obviously influenced the way that I write. I think it's more interesting that I, unprompted, asked the question, what was it like? Because that's the way that my mind runs, that's all.
That's your temperament. People talking profiles about, may not be true, a body being found in a pond near your childhood home. They've seized on that. Is that story true?
No, that's. I think that that's confused with a story that my mother used to tell. She said that I used to play with a little boy from the next yard over, and that one day I came home by myself, and that I was pale, and that I went upstairs and closed the door to my bedroom, and she said that the little boy had been run over on a train track, and that she believed that we had been playing together, and that he had wandered away and had been struck by a train. And it was certainly an incident that she talked about that I used in a story called The Body that was made into a film, Stand By Me. Whether or not that happened, she didn't even know that. And what I remember again, though, and this is what I mean when I say that I think that the Freudian business is mostly codswallop. She said to me that they had to pick up the pieces in a basket. And that's what I remember. That was the part that stuck in my mind the most vividly. They had to pick up the pieces of this boy in a basket. Not that I could have been killed instead of him, not that I might have seen it happen. What I remembered was the vivid description, because again, that's a part of me that's sensitized, not because of any Freudian experience, not because of any primal scene, not because of any complex psychological or sociological background, but simply because that was passed down through my genes. It's what I do.
As a child, as an adolescent, did you read horror stories?
Yes, I did. I read a lot of horror stories as a kid. Again, that was a place that my mind inclined toward, and I just loved that. The one that woke me up, I think, was a novel by Richard Matheson called I Am Legend. It was nominally it's a science fiction novel. It's set a little bit in the future, or at least what would have been the future in 1960. And the last normal man on Earth in a world full of vampires is living in a suburban house in California, and in his workshop he's taking baseball bats and the equivalent of cricket bats over here and sharpening them into stakes and going out and finding vampires who have hidden, for instance, in the meat locker of the local supermarket. And what excited me about the book was that it combined what I thought of as a classical horror creature, the vampire, with things that I understood to be a part of modern everyday life, baseball bats, supermarkets, suburban streets, suburban housing developments, and I thought that's what I want to do.
And that's in fact what you have done. I mean, that suburban setting, often Maine, and in fact in the preface to the new novel Bag of Bones you say you want to go back to my Maine. That territory, it's your home territory, but that's very important to your books, isn't it?
The home territory is, because it's what I know. I remember somebody saying once, it might have been Robert Frost, your town, once you know where the roads go, it's yours. And Maine is a place where I know where most of the roads go. The same way, when my wife, Tabitha, saw that the new book, the main character, Mike Noonan, is a writer, she kind of rolled her eyes and groaned and said, "Oh, Steve, not another writer." And I said, "You don't roll your eyes and groan when you pick up a Dick Francis. You don't say, 'Oh, Dick, another jockey,' you know?"
I want to talk about the writer books later on, but in terms of Maine, part of the importance of that, apart from the fact that you know it, is in terms of the genre, that it's not a place where you would expect many of these events to happen. It's that contrast, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that one of the great things about literature, the fantastic, is that it enables us to go to Narnia through the wardrobe. The wardrobe is a perfectly ordinary place, and C.S. Lewis knew that. I like to combine what's ordinary with what's extraordinary, because I think I think that it actually helps to make the ordinary things new again to us. If you put a vampire in a small Maine town, or if you put ghosts or secrets in a small, sleepy village, it makes the village stand out. It's like creating a strong backlight.
You've been asked a lot this question as to why people like reading horror so much. You've written a whole book about it. You said that the horror novel works classically on two levels, what you call the gross out level and then the phobic pressure points. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I think that on a very, very simple level, it is not much different than a kid at the supper table who says to his sister, "You want to see something really awful?" And he opens his mouth and shows all the half-chewed food, and that is a gross-out level. I've said before in books that I want to terrify because that's the finest emotion in terms of fear. But if I can't get terror, I'll go for horror, and if I can't get to horror, I'll go to the gross out. I did a film called Creepshow that had 5 stories that were throwbacks to the comic magazines of the 50s, the EC Comics in the States, that had perfected the art of the gross out. And my favorite episode, the one with E.G. Marshall, he had a phobia about bugs. And at the end, he swells up and his chest bursts open and bugs pour out, and the bugs pour out of his mouth. They're cockroaches. We used hundreds of thousands of cockroaches in the show. And that's just simply that atavistic reaction. I was saying that I'm a Jungian, and I think that we do have, as part of our genetic grab bag, our valise, if you will, certain basic fears that work on a gross out level. The fear of bugs, the fear of squishy things, sensations that we get in the dark. You know, there's a game called Dead Man that we play in the States, the kids play in the States, where they turn off the lights and somebody will hand around peeled grapes and say, "This is the dead man's eyes." Or you'll pass around a cold spaghetti and say, "These are the dead man's guts," you know. Kids like it. Kids enjoy the gross out, and they enjoy it on the level of knowing that it's not real. It's like an amusement park ride, and it's scary, but it's a safe scare. But on another level, I think that we use our make-believe horrors the way that we use our dreams, and that is to kind of not necessarily explicate our fears, because I'm not sure that we can ever really explicate them, but certainly we can articulate them.
But do you believe in catharsis, though? Because I would have thought if, for example, like I'm frightened of being in houses alone. Now, when I read The Shining, it doesn't cure me of that fear. It expresses it, and actually it makes it worse.
Well, in fact, aren't you more afraid of being in the house where you should be alone and aren't?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are a number of really basic fears, and I think that most of them boil down to the idea that we understand that we're going to die because we're thinking rational creatures, and certainly we can extrapolate the fact from what we see in the world around us. Everything dies. There's a Bruce Springsteen song that says, everything dies, baby, that's a fact, but maybe anything that dies someday comes back, which is the scary part of it. But it's also a little bit comforting, the idea that maybe there is a survival after death. But we're afraid of death, and yet at the same time we can't contemplate it because we've always been alive. So we've got a basic conflict here that has to be resolved in some way, and one of the ways that we resolve it is to kind of take these little test explorations of death and darkness and the whole land of I don't know what's going on here, because life, I think that we understand that life is a thin skin over a very long period of time before, when we weren't here, and a very long period of time afterward when we're going to be gone, and we don't understand any of that, and we try all sorts of different ways to try and make sense of that riddle. Religion, popular fantasy, popular fiction, movies, records.
You've talked about, as well, national phobic pressure points, the way in which a horror story will tap into something that is there generally in society. Now, famously, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which touched on fears about science and people would now say about women's fears of childbirth. Now,
Hmm.
you've done that several times. I think I was rereading Carrie, your first published book, about, as many people know, the girl who has these powers and eventually destroys her high school. Now, reading it now, it struck me that it's about, we talk about genetics a lot now, but it's about parents' fears of how their children will turn out. There might be something lurking there. But also, in the light of all these recent school shootings in America, that fear of what children might do to other children, all of that we now see is there.
Yeah. When I wrote Carrie, I think one of the things that interested me, I have to turn my own mental clock back quite a while to get to that point, but I wrote Carrie in 1972, and that was really a period when the women's liberation movement was starting to gather steam. We were long miles from where we've come to today, to the degree of equality we've come to in the States. When I wrote Carrie, I wrote about a girl who discovers this awesome power to basically bring down everything. I think that it's quite natural for people to express the fears of their time and their society in horror fiction the way that they express fears in dreams. So the first job that the writer has when you write this kind of material is to be completely natural and just simply tell the story. I think it would get in the way to think about, well, what is it that I'm afraid of? What am I expressing in a larger sense? What does this tell me about society? Story's never about society. Story's never about politics. Story is about story, and that's all it's about. But when the story's done, I think it's possible to stand back a little bit and say, well, I took all this time to write this story. Why? What was it that drove me? Because at that point, the story's out, and you can deal with it on a different level. So that when I look at something like Firestarter, which is one of the early books, I can say to myself, what this talks about is a real fear of big government, of fascist elements in government. Big Brother is watching. There were a lot of baggage that I carried out of the 60s as a student radical. Now, at the age of 50, Bag of Bones, the new book, is about a man whose wife has died. And I've reached an age where people do die. I've just gotten to the point in my generation where people sometimes call up and say, did you hear so-and-so's husband had a heart attack? Did you hear so-and-so's wife has cancer and isn't expected to live? So that, of course, I'm afraid of losing my mate. You can no longer say that's somebody else's problem when you get to my age. It's there. It isn't something that we talk about at dinner parties or anything, but it's something maybe you think about at night when you can't sleep. So that, in a way, Bag of Bones was my attempt to explore the fear of what it would be like to live without a partner. We're now coming to that time of life. The baby boom generation, we're not babies anymore.
There's a big fuss recently because the co-star of The X-Files announced he didn't believe any of this stuff in it. Now, he's only an actor, you're a writer, but the question arises. You write a lot about ghosts, about hauntings, about the undead, about extraterrestrials occasionally. Is that a literary convention, or do you believe in that stuff?
Well, we were talking a little bit before about the fact that you're afraid of houses when you're there alone. Obviously, you're a rational, thinking human being, and you know that you're perfectly okay. But we do have an imaginative side to our nature, don't we? And it can be very strong. I think that the proper answer to your question is that now, under bright fluorescent lights, sitting in a radio studio where all the equipment works and I can see well and I can hear well, I believe very little of it. But turn out the lights and lock the doors and put me in here by myself on a cold, windy, rainy night, and I believe quite a lot more.
Just touching, it's again a Freudian thing, I'm afraid. Do stories or plot lines ever result from dreams or nightmares of yours?
They do. But again, I'm not sure if dreams or nightmares come from any real significant place. I think that a lot of times they're just efforts to work out the day's events and some of the things that we have on our minds when we go to sleep. I also think that on a couple of occasions, it's that imaginative faculty that you tap into in the daytime to write the books. If you're roadblocked on a story, on a couple of occasions, I've actually had dreams that have clarified what I'm supposed to do in the book.
You mentioned having written about novelists a number of times. Now, a recurrent theme there is the unhappiness, even the danger of being a popular writer in America. You've had experience of this. It probably wouldn't have happened to John Updike. One of your fans actually turned up at your house, claimed there was a bomb there. In books like Misery, you're working out that the fear of your readers, aren't you?
Well, I think to some degree I am. Again, when I wrote Misery, it never occurred to me that that's what I was doing at the time that I was writing it. After the book was actually done, after it was done just being the story, and I'm able to step back a little bit and say, is this about any more than the story? Certainly that came to mind. Yeah, there have been some obsessive fans who have come to the house. I remember my wife saying that one day she came in from the garden and there was a woman standing there, a woman that neither of us knew, in the middle of the kitchen, looking in cupboards. And my wife said, "Who are you?" And the woman said, "Oh, I'm just a fan. I want to see how he lives, but I'm not one of the crazy ones." Can you imagine?
And I read there was, at one point, there was a man living outside your house in Maine who claimed that he was you. He lived in a camper van or something.
That man's name is Stephen Lightfoot, and he doesn't claim that he's me, but I do think that a lot of people who are a little bit mentally unstable feel that you're famous, that you somehow stole their fame, and they've come to get it back, and that's the case with him. He shows up every now and then.
And do you take precautions against this, like a politician would?
Yes and no. I don't have a bodyguard, and I don't live with two Doberman pinchers running around the yard with their vocal cords cut so that they can attack silently. I do want to have a life. I don't feel that there's any sort of a devil's bargain that I've been a part of where I'm saying, you give me success as a writer and I'll give up my right to have a private life. So that I've worked very hard to have a private life. But given all that, one has to be realistic. Yeah, we have the burglar alarm. Yes, we have the motion sensors. And we've taken more precautions since the man broke into the house who claimed that on one hand he was a fan and on the other hand that he had a bomb.
You've written a couple of novels recently about survivors or sufferers from abuse of various kinds. In Gerald's Game, it was incest. In Rose Madder, domestic violence. Now, those are very different from your earlier books. They're suspense novels, but they have a clear liberal agenda. Where does that come from?
Well, I think it comes from the way that I was raised, and certainly I became involved with a lot of causes in the 60s, anti-war, and, you know, a little bit, I call myself a radical before. I'm not sure I was really a radical, but I was considerably to the left of center. And I've been interested in women's issues. Partially, I think that some of the books about women simply come from the fact that I was raised by a woman, and I was raised in the company of women rather than in the company of men. I'm interested, too, in trying to be a male writer who's written about women in a little more dimension. I can remember reading Leslie Fiedler's Love and Death in the American Novel, where he said that in American fiction, written by men, at least, all women are either zeros or destroyers, and there's no in between. They're very flat characters, from all the way from Mark Twain to Ross Macdonald and some of the detective novelists. And I thought, well, I want to be able to do better than that if I can.
In Bag of Bones, Michael Noonan, the writer, he's obsessed with what other writers are selling in his field. Now, when it was reported last year that you'd asked for $17 million for Bag of Bones, it was widely seen as a status thing. You were saying, I'm bigger than Grisham Clancy. Was it that?
Mm-hmm. No, it really wasn't. What it was a mistake. When the negotiations took place, I was in Australia, and my agent, who was actually an accountant, was dealing with the negotiations, and he ran the figures for me. And it certainly looked as though the book would generate somewhere between 17 and $21 million in income. And when my publisher wouldn't go ahead and offer a contract for that amount, we went elsewhere, and that was when it got into the press. There was certainly no intent to be arrogant or to be money grubbing on my part, but it looked that way, and I grew deeply embarrassed by the whole thing. So I pulled back from that, and I took an advance that will be easily earned out, and basically took a much larger profit participation.
In your early days, you often spoke about your books as rather disposable. You said the literary equivalent of Big Mac and fries. There are hints in Bag of Bones, there are references to Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, that you take yourself a bit more seriously now. If you were offered the choice, Bag of Bones could sell millions, or it will win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which would you take?
Sell millions. No question about it.
You really don't care about
I
serious
care.
claim prizes?
I care, and I'm as serious when I sit down to write, certainly, as Martin Amis is. I believe that I'm working as hard with what I have as Martin Amis is working with what he has, or Frank McCourt, or Roddy Doyle, or any novelist that you'd care to mention, Don DeLillo, who's regarded as a serious literary writer. We've created an arbitrary dichotomy that seems to me to be every bit as ridiculous as the idea that there really is a Freudian subconscious consisting of the ego and the id and the superego. The dichotomy we've created is that on one hand we have literature which is serious and therefore can't sell very many copies because there are just a few smart people out there, and we always include ourselves in that small coterie of smart people. And over here we have this huge army of dumbos who buy Stephen King, Tom Clancy, Danielle Steele, Jeffrey Archer. Well, indeed, there are a number of popular writers who are not very good writers, who sell gazillions of copies. But there are also a number of writers who are hard-working, honest craftsmen who sell well. But in a way, the question, which would I prefer, to sell millions of copies or get the Pulitzer Prize, is a question that doesn't have any practical meaning, because they don't give guys like me the Pulitzer Prize, even if we earn it.
Very brief final question. You've written dozens of books. You even had to employ a pseudonym at one point to write more. The novelist in Bag of Bones, he has writer's block throughout the book. At the end, he renounces the novel completely.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a joke or is that a threat?
It's not a threat or a joke. It's a way of saying I'm getting to the end of the work that I have to do. I think that you come to a point. It's marvelous that we're as creative as we are. We have maybe 6 or 8 inches of gray jelly in between one ear and the other, and we're able to create numerous stories that are new and feel fresh, but we're not God. There is a finite point where you say, I have not necessarily done all the work that I could do, but I've done all the original work it's in me to create. And I don't think that I've quite reached that point yet, but I think that I'm closing in on it.
Stephen King, thank you very much.
Thank you.